Welcome, Aditi. Aditi is co-founder and lead at Minorities in Peace and Security, a network that is aimed at advancing the leadership and professional development of all minorities in the fields of international peace, security, and conflict transformation. They provide an intersectional lens to global policy issues in these areas and push for meaning, professional diversity, representation, and equitable inclusion. Aditi is also currently Policy Director at Protection Approaches, an organisation focused on preventing identity-based violence and atrocities. She's an executive board member at Air Wars, a not-for-profit transparency watchdog, which tracks, assesses, archives and investigates civilian harm claims resulting primarily from explosive weapons used in conflict-affected nations, including Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia and Yemen. Aditi was formerly director of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Drones and Modern Conflict, where she drove cross-party scrutiny of UK security, defence and foreign policy and coordinated efforts to better protect civilians in conflict. With all that experience, I'm sure you'll have some really in-depth insights for us tonight. So over to you, Aditi. And I will screen share your image.
Great.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
There you go.
Great. All right, thanks, Jo, and thanks everyone for listening to me today. It's a real honour to be invited. You see the two pictures on the screen. I chose these pictures because they speak to a few things. To me, they speak to the impact of racial and intersectional power dynamics in security policy. They speak to the eternal question of who security policy is written for. They speak to the power inherent in vested interests that underpin our governance and policy-making structures. So the first picture shows police outside Parliament breaking up an XR protest, a huge number of police using brute force to run through and break up a crowd of peaceful protesters. I watched this from my office at the time at Millbank in Parliament and noted how during the Black Cab protest, there were no heavy-handed police tactics. A respectful distance was given despite taxis blocking up Westminster Bridge and surrounding roads. You know, a key election target versus actions call for urgent action to address our climate emergency. The second picture is another form of protest, bringing together issues that came to the fore during the COVID-19 pandemic, laying bare the disproportionate impact of bad policy on people of colour and minorities and the harm of systemic inequalities. In recent years, we've seen many incidents that speak to these issues. We've had excessive force being used at vigils led by women about the murder of Sarah Everard, by a police officer, and the revelation of deep and dangerous misogyny and racism in the police afterwards. In the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests, this is the first time the reality of police aggression has touched a privileged majority, and the shock is palpable, though unsurprising to many of us. We've had the passing of the 300-page Police Crimes Sentencing and Courts Act, a crackdown on protests that are too noisy or annoying and aimed at stopping the serious disruption caused by climate and Black Lives Matter activists. It's telling that the bill mentioned the word memorial 8 times and women only once at a time when the country is being rocked with outrage at racial and gender-based violence. How about we ask, what about protecting the most vulnerable and responding to citizens' concerns instead? This bill is now an act, but was thankfully diluted and challenged by the House of Lords, funnily enough our non-elected House, only for the new public order bill to be introduced to bring back offences around disruption and locking on. We've had the Home Office's policy decreeing migrants who arrive in the UK by routes they deem illegal to be liable for removal to Rwanda, even if they are granted asylum, simultaneously scapegoating those who flee conflict and disaster whilst destroying their rights. Priti Patel claimed they were not genuine asylum seekers and they were just elbowing out women and children who are at risk. Recent research that was published, I think this week or last week, shows nearly 3/4 of people in a sample of 213 people who were threatened with being sent to Rwanda have fled from countries where they have successful asylum applications. Finally, the long-awaited Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities report published last year flatly denied the existence of institutional racism, instead focusing on the paltry acknowledgement that the term Black, Asian and minority ethnic isn't fit for purpose and that the UK is a model of progress. The landmark report challenges the view that Britain has failed to make progress in tackling racial inequality, suggesting the well-meaning idealism of many young people who claim the country is still institutionally racist is not borne out by the evidence. One thing I can say with confidence is that 250,000 people didn't march in summer 2020 simply to abolish a piece of terminology. The report ignores glaring facts that in the UK, Black Caribbean children are 3.5 more times likely to be excluded from school than their white counterparts. Black children are 4 times more likely to be arrested. Black people are 9 times as likely to be stopped and searched by police, and Black women 4 times as likely to die in childbirth. 60% of frontline medical staff who died during the pandemic were Black or people of colour. And in England, there has been between 2.5 to 4.3-fold greater COVID mortality rates across a range of Black and South Asian ethnic groups compared with white groups. So you can see these policies have culminated over a decade of a concerted strategy of politics by division. The UK's withdrawal from the European Union, Brexit, was underpinned by a slow simmer of xenophobia and resulted in hardening of racial divides and empowering of ideas of white superiority. The referendum gave a sense of urgency, normalising racism in a veil of Euroscepticism and taking back control of borders. The representation in Parliament shows how who these policies are made by and in the benefit of, from MPs to committees to civil service heads. This disparity also filters through to who influences policy and who staffs offices of power, including leaders of think tanks, NGOs, and established institutions. You struggle to see non-white and diverse leadership. There are also many hurdles to jump through before you're trusted and taken seriously if you haven't got the checkboxes of think tank, Oxbridge, civil service, or military on your CV. This is exclusionary elite, and it's tough to survive as a minority in these spaces. These power dynamics show entrenched racial, patriarchal, heteronormative, ableist, all the isms, all the inequalities. They show who the system currently benefits over others and which interests it privileges over others. For example, military strength and arms sales versus climate action. So what I'm trying to say is we need to take agency over the ideas about who policy is made for. Redefining security is just that, taking agency over what makes us human, who and what we value for our well-being, freedom, and yes, safety, but in a way that is inclusive and truly represents the lived experiences of all. At the same time, we have to do everything we can to safeguard our means of accountability and evaluation and holding government to account. If we sleepwalk into a situation where protest is illegal, media and knowledge production and think tanks are led by vested interests, the courts are being more and more limited in their independence and discretion, then we have to do so much more work just to be heard. So I hope in seeing these pictures, you protect and fight for your rights in these security policy spaces. And this doesn't just mean protest, it means choosing jobs that have a social impact, making conscious choices of where you invest your time and money, registering and using your vote, connecting with those around you, and seeing our shared values and principles globally. None of this is possible as alone, and as communities, consumers, professionals, advocates, writers, artists, creators, we are more powerful together. Thanks.
Thank you, Aditi. That was really powerful. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to introduce Ameen now, who will speak to us. Ameen Nemer is a political activist and researcher from Arabia, focused on the Saudi affair. Ameen is based in Scotland. He collaborates frequently with the European Saudi Organisation for Human Rights, a non-profit organisation established by a group of activists aiming to strengthen the commitment to human rights principles in Saudi Arabia. They work to urge the legislature and executive to activate human rights and raise awareness among and empower citizens of their rights through education. So with the work you do and the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the UK and how that impacts people's security, I'm sure this will be really fascinating. I mean, and I'll move on to your slide. I hope I will.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah.
And thanks, Aditi, as well, for her speech. And thank you, everyone. So from the photo here, this is me holding the name of Safir Jubran Ali Al-Saadi. a Yemeni civilian who was killed in an airstrike on the 30th of March 2015, just 5 days after launching the war on Yemen by the Saudi-led coalition, which is supported by the UK and the US. As-Saadi was killed among 24 other civilians in Al-Mazraq camp, as documented by Yemeni Archive. This photo was taken by Cindy Sasha in Glasgow, August 2021, for a campaign called Portrait of Resistance, organized by Campaign Against Arms Trade, furthering activists in the UK. I was asked to be photographed in a place of significance to my work. I couldn't think of a better place, which is worse in a different perspective, other than outside one of the BAE system buildings in Glasgow, as you can see in the background of this photo. Saudi Arabia, where I come from, is the UK's biggest arms customer. The top two main arms exporters to Saudi Arabia are the US and the UK, and both have a great influence on the Saudis' war on Yemen. I would quote Bruce Riedel of Brookings Institute in April 2016. That's a year after the war on Yemen. He said, if the United States of America and the United Kingdom tonight told King Salman that this war has to end, it would end tomorrow, because the Royal Saudi Air Force cannot operate without American and British support. End of the quote. And in 2019, a further explanation for the British influence came from a BAE Systems former worker in a documentary film by Channel 4, Britain's Hidden War Dispatch, when he said, with the amount of aircraft they have got and the operational demand, if we were not there in 7 to 14 days, there wouldn't be a jet in the sky. End of the quote. These two quotations show how Britain is heavily involved in the Saudi war on Yemen, and Britain could have taken a neutral side at times when it had the chance. For example, Jeremy Hunt, as Foreign Secretary, gave a speech in Berlin in 2019 titled Britain and Germany, an Alliance of Values. After his speech, he had written to Berlin to ask the German government to ease its stance and its arms sales halt to Saudi Arabia, or face damage to its credibility or commercial credibility. Hunt could say to the Saudis, for example, they're our historic allies, we would like to sell you our Typhoon, but the Germans don't allow us to do so. But Jeremy did not say so. Yes, alliance of values that are limited to some parts of the world, apparently. And as I was watching a report by the German TV, Deutsche Welle, with the caption, German town pays the price for Saudi export ban. The report mentioned the need of money to repair a school, take care of health and prosperity of the community, but of course wouldn't link that this prosperity comes by destroying someone else's schools and hospitals. And the idea of the ban came after the murder of the Saudi journalist in the Saudi Council in Istanbul, which is appalling. But there were many crimes in Yemen, despite being described as may amount to a war crime and possible war crime, the kind of language which makes the crimes as mild as possible, to sweep them under the carpet and prolong the war, which is foiled by arms. It's not a surprise, then, that the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, visited Saudi Arabia on the 16th of March last year, just 4 days after the mass execution of 81 on one day. And to show how confident the Saudi regime was, more executions were announced on the day of the visit. And I will share as well a link for further details about this execution. Just yesterday, there was a detailed report by BBC through 2 organizations. On your time, you can check it later. Just it was published yesterday. And so Boris was visiting Saudi Arabia for oil last year, but it's good to highlight it was the first British Prime Minister visit after the Khashoggi's murder, and therefore it was seen as a political whitewash for MBS, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Saudi Arabia is a rich country, we know that, but until today, there are many schools and health centers in Saudi Arabia which are actually rented houses. This means they are built and designed for living rather than for educational and health purposes. It is just that the Saudi government found these houses affordable to use. And this has been the case for decades, even in peacetime. On the other hand, billions of pounds are spent on weapons for the military, and the result is the destruction of schools and hospitals in Yemen. Total absurdity. The Saudi-British relation could be changed to be based on welfare, not warfare, and we would have a different outcome. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean that really puts in context what a lot of UK security policy means for others around the world. So thank you for sharing that. It's very powerful indeed. So last but not least, we have Sarah Lasoye from Medact. She's the campaigns and program lead at Medact, a global public health charity. She heads up Medact's Peace and Security program, supporting health workers to conduct research and campaign for change on issues such as the securitization of health and the health and humanitarian impacts of arms, global conflict and war. Sarah has a background in student organising, higher education campaigning and global health research. Her research interests and wider work are focused on addressing state violence and developing an abolitionist public health. So very much looking forward to your reflections from all that you do to uphold human security. So I'll get onto your image there.
Thanks so much, Jo, for that introduction, and also to Aditi and Ameen for your contributions as well. I feel very lucky to get to go last because I feel like there's so much that's been introduced around security. The image that you can all see here is one that I took personally. I found it while scrolling through my camera roll and thought, yeah, it would be a pertinent one to try and talk through and to try and think through my understandings of security. And yeah, just to say, I think, to introduce, I guess, my formal work as Jo has, I wanted to mention that Medact is a public health campaigning organization working with health workers and members of the health justice community, so anyone who cares about health justice, to organize and campaign around issues related to economic justice, climate justice, peace and security issues, and migration and access to healthcare as well. So there's a broad range of campaigning that all relates back to, in some way, shape, or form, an understanding of an aspect of security or an element of what makes us feel secure or safe, as people living and trying to live. But yeah, I think that our understanding organizationally and as a member-led organization from the health workers we work with, our understanding of securitization is one I really wanted to also make mention of before I then talk about the photo explicitly. So when we speak about securitization within the context of health, within, in relation to the NHS in particular, we mean the introduction of and encroachment of typically, quote, hard approaches to security. So policing, Aditi mentioned the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act that has recently passed, and the implications for public sector workers in that bill broadly would kind of touched on the increased presence and powers of police across a range of services. It also speaks to counter-terror policies, such as the statutory prevent duty, around which the securitization of health group members do a lot of organizing and campaigning around. It speaks to borders and hostile environment policies in the NHS. It speaks to migrant charging for healthcare services. And it broadly means the entanglement of security, state security agencies, policies and practices into healthcare spaces. And of course, the question always comes back to why we do this work. And I think it's because we understand the kind of antithetical nature of these forms of hard security and healthcare and well-being, and an understanding of a holistic health that we are campaigning for and moving towards. So in the image, which is very personal and very much not specific to a healthcare setting, you can see a road. I'm about to cross the road in the image. There's a sticker that says, "Build communities, not cages." And there's a police car just in the background. It's night. And then on the other side of the road, you can see a large billboard with a HSBC advert on it. And I chose this photo because it made me think of many different things. So I thought about whether or not I wanted to talk about community relationships or health specifically. But I thought this photo really well illustrates my thinking around what keeps me safe personally, who keeps me safe, what keeps me safe, and how. And for me personally, I understand safety as community, as somebody who has organized with and is a member of many marginalized and minoritized groups who have experienced the sharpest ends of the harms of state security. I understand that so much strength and feeling of safety and an understanding of safety is shared, is collective, and comes from that sense of collective resistance to really oppressive and harmful security forces. My understanding of security has been shaped by my engagements with social movements like Community Action on Prison Expansion, who are a community group based in London, a community of organisers, campaigners, activists who are prison abolitionists, and whose work primarily is focused around building a movement to oppose the expansion of prisons, detention centres and secure schools. And build communities, not cages, is a slogan that's been used across the abolitionist movement globally, but also is one particular to that group and many others in the UK. They're not the only one as well. But it's important to say, that this provocation made me think about community groups, community organizing, collective resistance, making the increased difficulty of doing any form of collective organizing due to government and state legislation imposing restriction after restriction on this kind of organizing. It also made me think about how people who are doing organizing against these hard forces of security that serve to separate, isolate, criminalize, particularly marginalized people, particularly people who are already experiencing a range of different unmet social, economic, and political needs. That, despite my real love and care of these organizing spaces, I'm not really able to share pictures of those organizers here, or, screenshots of group chat messages that, people in organizing and resistance spaces have, because that would make them very insecure and unsafe. So I think it made me think about how, despite these spaces being really secure for me and providing a lot of sense of, a huge sense of security for many, that sense of they are also criminalized, reflexively. And so it's hard to see, it's hard to identify, and it's hard to really communicate the importance of the work that's being done. I think the contrast with the police car in the background is probably quite self-explanatory. Security to me isn't something that is brought about by policing or criminalization. The police, as we've known, for a very long time, are active perpetrators of violence, particularly of marginalized and minoritized communities. And also fundamentally the response that policing is to supposed or to real harms that take place in society don't actually, as I mentioned before, address all of the unmet needs that we've identified for a long period of time, but instead serve to kind of uphold the system and the cycle of maintaining hierarchies of power, hierarchies of oppression, and not supporting people in the ways that they clearly need. And then on the other side, just to speak quickly to the billboard, it made me think back to how in 2020, I think it is, there was a really popular community resistance effort by a group called Brandalism, which I'll leave a link to in the chat here, that essentially just kind of highlighted how HSBCs, and many different corporate organizations and institutions, banks obviously a very easily identifiable one, have many different forms of investments, right? And this was there was a campaign against HSBC throughout 2020 in response to a HSBC campaign, that year, that highlighted that there was £67 billion worth of investments in fossil fuel projects by HSBC since 2016, so over a 4-year period. And that included financing for fracked gas, oil drilling, resulting in deforestation and gas extraction projects that led to community displacement on human rights abuses and human rights abuses in Mozambique. Artworks in that project also highlighted significant investments in for-profit US prisons and detention centers, which have obviously long been criticized for separating families and using also incarcerated migrants as a source of cheap labor. They invested in companies like the one that Ameen's image referenced, BAE Systems, who have been also long implicated in funding and fueling wars across the world, and wars that have resulted in serious human rights abuses and violations. So there's a lot on that page. Hopefully you can spend time going through all of that. But I wanted to also highlight, I guess, in this image, the implication and role of large corporations and institutions in upholding insecurity, funding insecurity in ways that we don't necessarily think of a lot of the time. And adverts like this, it says always by your side, but always by whose side, I suppose. If it is Lloyds Bank, please forgive me, but the point still remains. Someone in the chat mentioned that this is probably Lloyds Bank, in which case maybe we should look into Lloyds investments, which I will do. But yeah, I wanted to highlight, hopefully, that and the image still does, that a part of our, I guess, thinking around security and securitization, for me, goes beyond the NHS, it goes beyond the health service, and is more so about every aspect of our day-to-day lives, I suppose, and realizing that part of our resistance needs to be collective, it needs to be in the community at the grassroots level, and also addressing where power is hoarded in society more broadly. So I feel like I've gone over time. I should have probably collated those notes more smoothly. But thank you for having me, and also for Aditi and Ameen's comments too.
Thank you, Sarah. You didn't go over time. I'm going to stop share and think I'm going to put this back onto the gallery view in time for questions. That was a really important reminder. That community connection, solidarity is the foundation of our security. You've all spoken about the importance of inclusion, of agency, and of our humanity being recognised as critical for security. Something state security is not always renowned for, and not only the political establishment, but the military industrial complex and large corporate entities who tend to have other interests other than our own security. So thank you so much for your contributions. They've all been really powerful, and I found it so helpful to see how you've used images to reflect on those and all that's been in those images for you. They've been, yeah, a really great way into discussing that. I know we're quite a large group, but we do have some time for questions and reflections. So like I said, yeah, we've got about 10, 15 minutes. So if any of you have any reflections or questions, anyone in the room, including Aditi, Ameen and Sarah, if you want to comment or reflect on the others' input, feel free to do so. So please do use the raised hand function at this point if you'd like to make any contribution, and I'll invite you to do so. I'm hoping that that will let me see you, if you do. No comments or questions? Diana, was that a hand?
I was just saying it was also amazingly clear and powerful. I don't have a question. I'm just absolutely convinced by everything that's been said.
Thank you. Yeah, and it doesn't need to be a question. It can be a reflection about what that made you think about, what those photos made you think about, what the talks made you think about. It's I guess it's a little bit of a practice. I mean,
yeah, I've just linked, as Aditi and Sarah both have police there, and for BAE system, it's not a police, yes, but the security aspect of it, like we are keeping you safe. And I mean, by providing weapons to a country to protect, that's the word they use. And even Ministry of Defense, as George Orwell, Ministry of War. But I just, 2019, I attended an annual general meeting for BAE system, organized that time by CAT, Campaign Against Arms Trade. And it was an opportunity. They have a promo for their shareholders in the beginning. The beginning was just children running in a slow motion in a field, a green and sunny day. And then they used the word protection. And I was saying, yeah, of course, that wouldn't be a country that a country is bombed by your weapons. It wouldn't be safe and beautiful, greeny and sunny. You wouldn't use something like that. So basically, that promo was just for the shareholders, basically. It's not for the countries which are affected by wars and by the weapons which are produced and manufactured by BAE systems. Yeah, just the link between what is security, what is insecurity. Yeah.
thank you. Yeah, I think there's often very different definitions depending on who you ask. And I think you've all highlighted the way in which those who are not asked, those who are marginalized in this discourse or in any kind of political thinking are people who suffer, who are often described as a security problem and suffer the consequences of security policy. And I think that's been something that's become even more apparent as through this alternative security review, we've discussed with a lot of different civil society groups how government policies affect the security of a lot of people in a lot of ways, from food security to the way that foreign policy is made. It seems that there's such a huge disjuncture. So
I was just going to add, sorry, Joe, that made me think so much about how, so like a lot of community organizers, abolitionists in particular, will say, you know, do you want to be the recipient of a kind of safety, quote unquote, that is like predicated on the insecurity, lack of safety, violence perpetrated against others? Because these systems obviously don't, you know, we can say the bad people are over there and they're in prison, and then the good people aren't. And there was a parallel between what you just shared, Ameen, that made me think of that exactly on an international level. Do we want to be the recipients of a kind of like nationalized state security that is predicated on, you know, active violence and like insecurity on a global scale, and, you know, via the arms trade, via all of the things that we've mentioned today? So it feels like a lot of the narratives around security that we're told are like kind of like, if you want to be safe, someone has to be unsafe in some way. And that, I think there's trying to maintain a vision for something that is different and otherwise to that, and say, actually, I would like everyone to be included in my understanding of safety and security.
I think just to add something to that, Sarah's such a good point, that when it comes to kind of decision making, though, you know, for those processes and policies to be really reflective of intersectionalities and be really inclusive, it does mean a ceding of power. It does mean that some people need to take a step back, some interests need to take a step down. And I think that is the biggest challenge of all, because it's got to the point where, you know, it seems, especially in security policy, especially in the UK, because the Ministry of Defence and the military is the best equipped, most resourced, most staffed kind of arm of the UK government. So whenever it comes to any sort of crisis to do with security, it turns immediately to the Ministry of Defence. But that's not to say that there aren't allies who are willing to cede power, who are willing to have change. You know, a lot of my work at the all-party parliamentary group on drones and modern conflict was working with military personnel who were concerned about the UK's policies and the lack of civilian protection as a priority, because they could see that the outcomes in terms of security on the ground were not what they wanted to see. You know, it was just causing more and more violence and more insecurity. And so there's this division between kind of political decision making and people on the ground. And as well as that, in the Foreign Office, in the FCDO, there are so many allies who are working on a prevention first approach. You know, in protection approaches now, we've been working with the International Development Committee, who did a big inquiry on atrocity prevention, so preventing identity-based violence that we see. And the recommendations of the report were actually welcomed by the FCDO, and there's a new atrocity prevention hub, there's new staffing, but the problem is budget lines. Like, you can have things on paper and priorities on paper, and people fight for those because government isn't a monolith. But if you don't have the money behind it and the manpower, then it actually can't get anywhere.
Thank you. It's really interesting to hear a bit more about what goes on behind the scenes. And I see Diana and Nick have their hand up.
In the person of Diana. I've just been struck by the way we used to, at the beginning of We Security's life, talk a lot about common and shared security. And that's what I've been hearing from all of you who've spoken. It's really, really important that we stop thinking we have security at the expense of others or by controlling others, but we build security together.
Thank you. And even I find it really fascinating now that the UNDP have updated their definition of human security to include solidarity, which means common security. And Jane Stevenson, you're on mute.
Hello. I was just particularly interested in what Aditi was just saying then about the positive things that are going on behind the scenes. And it would be really good to think about ways in which we can share, you know, those stories could be shared because I think one of the things that gets very difficult when you're talking to people who are probably not so committed to the things that we're talking about is that they just can't see any alternative. And to be able to talk about positive things that are going on and where there is room for hope would be really useful to bring into those conversations. And I realise that some of what you were saying probably is, you know, is not, I don't know whether it's shareable or not, but I just feel that would be quite useful.
Yeah, Aditi, I don't know if you want to answer that.
Yeah, I can do. It is public. There's the government response to the International Development Committee's recommendations. So you can see clearly in that what officials in the FCDO are doing. I think also what's useful to keep in mind is that it really depends on how you frame a problem and how you frame an ask, because I think I've worked in NGOs, and I've also worked in sort of like on the inside, like in Parliament and more closely with government. And I've seen kind of all around. And I think the fact is that civil society is so diverse, and so you know, you need to have some sort of union across the political spectrum, and you need to have radical people who, you know, push the government, push the conversation to a place that establishment actors just can't. But in doing so, open up a space for more middle ground actors to push things slowly. I think one of the big lessons that I learned, especially engaging on military issues, security issues, is that you can go with the moral argument all you want, and people will agree with you, but they'll say you have no idea what the realities on the ground, you have no idea how complicated things are, and sort of pat you on the head and put you away. But if you come with evidence, with allies who are doing the work, actually implementing the policy, who say it's not working, this is what's going wrong, and actually use an efficacy argument. That does it work? Does your policy work? Is the outcome that you're seeing on the ground what you actually want to see? Are you meeting objectives for security? You'll see no, you know, like especially when you look at sort of like counterterrorism approaches, you see the number of, you know, jihadist groups has quadrupled. I think there was a IISS report that sort of laid that out. So you can see it's a failure of policy. So, you know, when you start from that, you know, what is it working? People listen a lot better.
Thank you again for your insights into that. And I think hopefully that works across all sectors as far as human security is concerned, because there's a lot that seems to be making people more insecure here and overseas. So I think now we'll move on to talking a little bit more about how visualizing security can work for those of us who would like to use it as part of the Alternative Security Review. And I hope that means everyone here that you're interested in doing so or want to find out more. So we're going to hear first from Shafia from Coventry University about how it was used in the research, and then move into breakout groups. So Shafia, welcome. Please tell us more about what happened when you used this photo voice method. And just let me know when you want me to share your image.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. First, thank you very much for this wonderful, useful inputs from Aditi, Ameen, and Sarah. And all the others who listened to their presentations. I don't know whether you noticed the same way as I did, but their images weren't just simple illustrations. Their images were part of the narrative. The images shaped the narrative. The images brought up a lot of parts, a lot of symbolic and emotional parts of their narratives that without the images wouldn't have been there. And I'm not sure about you, but I think seeing the images, especially Ameen's image, which kind of included someone's name who is deceased because of failed government politics and military politics, I think those emotions and those symbols and those powerful elements were kind of like they just put everything in a completely different direction than just like a talk without the images. And in academic research, people started to use arts-based research methods, and especially photo voice, because they also realized that there are some elements of reality, of this mixed and messy reality that we live in, that we cannot really just capture with words. You can have like hundreds of narrative interviews or focus groups where people talk about issues, but nothing is just as powerful if you tell those people to go out in their environment and instead of just talking about issues, to take photos, to check out their environment. Where are the symbols? Where are the images that symbolize or that stand for this certain issue, which is in this case security or insecurity? And the photo voice method, so it is by definition participatory, so that the research participants co-create like a discussion, a narrative, and they kind of like take part in this process as creators. It is also arts-based. It is both a data gathering method, but also data representation method, because a completely different database is there with not only the verbal information, but the images. And it is very good for community building, very good for critical, sorry, I can't read my own writing, critical dialogue, and also to address policymakers, because sometimes this is what you need, an image. An image is, you know, it is a cliche, but sometimes it says more than 1,000 words. So when we, when kind of like when the alternative security review started, and I needed to write a literature review, which also included my suggestions and recommendations of what methods we should use, I read in many places that especially like in this critical security research and like this non-traditional security research, they encourage people to use more innovative methods as well. And I also saw in not only one, but even more papers that some of these methods can be really, really critical, really, really innovative. And also arts-based methods like photo voice work very well with other methods, which can like build a very interesting mixed method approach. And one of the papers which I quote in the literature review combined photo voice with quantitative surveys, which seemed like two completely different methods, but they work very well together. So that's why I recommended in the literature review that we should use photo voice. And the way the photo voice research has worked so far was that we advertised the research in the city of Coventry, because that was our basic like this pilot setting. And then once people applied to our flyers and social media cards and word of mouth, we organized the briefing where we discussed the ethical and health and safety concerns of them going out and taking photos. Then they had 2 weeks to take the photos. And then after the 2 weeks, we had a discussion, which mostly were focus groups. But if someone needed to drop out last minute or couldn't show the photos in the group, then sometimes they were accompanied by narrative interviews with certain participants who couldn't make it to the focus groups. Then I transcribed what we already have, and we will have even more because some more cohorts are in line. And obviously there will be a thorough academic analysis, and obviously there will be the data representation in the form of academic papers, presentations, but also whatever might happen to the photos. So it's still an open question whether we can showcase the photos as very, very powerful messages about what people think about security. And now, Joe, please put up the photo that I chose as an example, which was taken by participant number 2. So I chose this photo. It's not there yet. Yeah. So I chose this photo because so participant number 2 couldn't make it to the focus group. So we had a narrative interview, and he kind of took all the photos to tell kind of a little story with them. And this element was particularly interesting because if like you can see that he took this photo of this house, and you can see on the right side of the photo that most of the fences in this area are those usual UK fences, like knee height size. And then this particular person who lives in this house built up this very big fence, which kind of implements that. So funnily enough, this discussion that I had with participant number 2 went in the direction that this person with this home looks kind of strange, because strange or even stranger, literally like a foreigner. So we joked around that he evoked his ethnicity, and I evoked a childhood memory about a similar situation that I witnessed in my area. And I also mentioned that like such a short fence outside of the UK might be, or even outside of Coventry might be surprising. And in other cases, the big fence is surprising. And we also asked the question what this person might have to hide behind this big fence, and what message the big fence delivers. And I really just chose this example to show you that yeah, like this is just a simple image, but it can invoke so many memories, emotions, ideas, maybe uncomfortable feelings, maybe your own theories. Who might live in the house? Why did he decide to build such a big fence? And so I think you might have gotten a glimpse from this that photo voice is an extremely promising and extremely innovative research method. And I really hope that what we do with photo voice might be a very useful addition to rethinking security's goals and all the yeah, like all the work that we are doing together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zsofia. That was really interesting to see that image and hear more about the discussion. When you sent it to me, I was kind of thinking, what is that about? Like, it's just a street, but there is so much in it, as you say. So yeah, thanks for sharing that and explaining a bit more. So to everyone else, I guess you've heard more about the value of this research, how it works, and the kind of things that come out of people being asked to take photos of what security and insecurity means to them, as well as hearing from Aditi, Sarah and Ameen about what their photos mean to them. So we really want to extend this as part of the evidence building for the Alternative Security Review and get as much input as possible from as many people as possible from a wide variety of locations across the UK and beyond. It really offers the opportunity for two things, I think. First of all, it provides a kind of engaging way into thinking about security for people who might come across the Alternative Security Review and rethinking security and think, oh, this is not for me, this is like policy, I don't do that. But actually, it's about all of our lives, and it's about really thinking about what security means. And secondly, hopefully, it's a really engaging way for you to bring people into discussions about security and insecurity. With the various crises that we face in this country and that are ongoing and unfolding elsewhere in the world, I think it's a really good time to open up these kinds of discussions and build that body of evidence that can be used to present alternative ways of approaching security at a national level and really speak about what people are concerned about, not necessarily what national security experts think we're concerned about. So the project is going to run from now until May, so there's plenty of time to engage people in